Hello, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, and this is ICC's Tata Steel recap for rounds 9 and 10. It was a tale of two quite different rounds. Round 9 produced just one decisive game, while round 2 saw four winners and losers. I'll have all those games for you, beginning with Anish Giri grabbing the sole lead by defeating Maxim Matlakov, who spoiled a better position and went downhill from there. All right, so let's get to it. Matlakov playing white, and he played a flank opening. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm not really going to focus on the early part of this game, but just get to kind of the critical moment. Because Giri playing a very solid line, and most people deal with the king's Indian attack by putting the pawn on d3, but Matlakov went for a Catalan approach, and rather than holding the line in the center, Giri decided to grab this pawn on c4. I often comment about how grandmasters don't care about that pawn anymore, and Matlakov just, played without it, used the open lines, gets that b file, and then he chases around the queen. He gets a lot of pressure over there, and black is really not in a position to defend the b pawn. So he's trying, he's got some tactics going. If white takes the pawn, there is this little bishop a3 move, so white has to get out of the way of that. Okay, now the knight b6 is not going to happen, so he brings the knight over to c4. That covers a3, so now he's ready to take b7. So this is really a first critical moment of the game. Matlakov plays knight d6. This is a mistake. He should play rook d1, getting out of the pins on the c file. He's threatening just to take on b4. He's potentially past a pawn. One variation is c takes d4. White can take on b4. And if rook takes c4, the knight comes into c6 rather effectively. And if black takes on b4, white takes back with an outside past a pawn, and the position is better for white. Not necessarily winning, but certainly I would say white is probably playing for two results. But that did not happen. Knight d6 was a mistake because the rook didn't have to move. Bishop a3. And that was a very useful knight he had to give up, and whereas the other knight is not really doing much. And bishop c6, probably also a mistake because he gets the pawns on double, but now he gets in this pin, and maybe he could have played bishop e4 here to get out of the pin. He just didn't sense the troubles. And that was a big mistake. He needed to play king e2, defends the pawn on e3, and that kind of gets out of the way of some things that black is trying. But rook c1 just walked into bishop a3. And here Matlakov is in time pressure, and that's really been a big problem for him in the tournament. And now, if the rook goes to c2, it can be defended by bishop e4, but knight d5 happens. And so the bishop can't get back to e4, threatening the pawn on e3, and to king e2, king d6, attacking the bishop. And white would have to play e4. So this is the best white could do, get to this position, play a pawn down, and hope to hold it. I don't know if it's completely lost. Maybe white can hold this, but king d3, but down a pawn. That was the best he could do at this point. Rook c3, bishop b4, and he took the bishop. So this is from the fire to the frying pan. Of course, flag hanging, that kind of thing happens. And now maybe he was ready to deal with king d6, but instead the pawn just rolls. And if the bishop move, bishop e4, knight takes a4, black is going to be able to take the pawn on a4 and queen shortly. So he pushes a5, but now the knight attacks the rook, can't take the knight because after the rook trade b2, can't stop it. And the rook has no place to go. B2 is happening, and they actually resigned there. He's going to lose the bishop to control the b pawn from queening. So a sudden disaster for Matlockov, where the position went sliding down from a promising situation, and thus Geary grabbed the lead, but his lead was short-lived as both of his pursuers scored in round 10. Now our feature game is Carlsen against So. I've read a little bit about this game. Some see in this game great opening preparation and deep insight into the resulting middle game. I'm not buying that so much. It looks more like Magnus playing on the edge, as we've seen. He's a great fighter. He loves to win, and he'll take chances. But when he's able to set problems for his opponent, he can be relentless. And So had a lot of different problems to solve along the way. And he went wrong in a few places, and Carlsen was able to win a long end game. So let's have a look. There's a lot to this game. Even though it was it was an end game with bishops opposite colors for a while, but it doesn't seem like much. And it doesn't look like much from here. This is not much of a way to start a game. It looks pretty boring, and can easily be an quick agreed draw. But here Carlsen plays c4. Now, this is a very provocative move. At first, it even looks like a finger failure, right? Because black can take this knight and then get bishop b4 check. It looks almost like a beginner's move. But the shocking thing is that there is a body of theory on this from this position, and it's being created by the top grandmasters. They're actually playing into this. In fact, Carlsen has already played this a couple of times against So in online blitz tournaments, and So has played this for white as well. I was really shocked to read about that. I would not have anticipated that this is something to willingly go into. But as it becomes tougher and tougher to beat somebody on theory, that grandmasters very often just want to get some different kind of position. Carlsen is very brave, right? Okay, so from this position, So plays bishop back to d6. Okay, so white had an idea to play c5 to trap the bishop. This is not forced, but makes sense to retreat. Bishop g5 and h6. I think black can also start with knight bd7, but it's not a bad idea to put question to the bishop. All right, Carlsen takes, which is also what Wesley So played in this position himself. In the other games, he played bishop h4. One game, So played g5 and knight e4, and he followed that up with g4, played kind of recklessly, and Carlsen got a winning position in that one. The other one, he played knight bd7, and white took on d5 and got to a kind of minority attack type position, quieter position, and Carlsen should have won both games, actually. He scored 1.5 out of 2. In this game, he takes the knight. When I first saw this position, I wondered why white doesn't play knight c3, but of course it's his queen on b1. So he takes, and he plays e4. Okay, this just does not look right to me. I'm sorry, because white is undeveloped, and he's offering to open the center. I'm not sure actually why black. Sorry. I'm not sure why he can't take on e4. It just occurred to me. But after queen e4 check, of course, since the white king is not on e1, it won't be. Black can't pin the queen against the king. So that's why he plays bishop e7. He gets out of the way. And then bishop b5 check. I guess he wants to provoke this move so the knight doesn't come out. But unsurprisingly, So decides to bust things open. Bust open the center. Queen c1. I guess it's maybe possible for black to play knight d7, but I don't think there's really anything wrong with black's moves. And now king e2 is kind of a gutsy decision as well, because, I mean, for most people, if you landed in this position, you'd probably trade those queens. A lot of people would trade those queens quickly. King e2, and it's okay, even position, very most likely a draw. Something like knight d4 check is not dangerous. f4, bishop b2, rook b1, and rook b7. Well, you know, white gets everything back. But Carlsen wants to win. He plays king e2, knight d4 check. Well, this is okay. I think that So could have really done better by playing queen b6. One idea is bishop c5 can come to hit f2, like rook e1, bishop c5 could be annoying. So computer suggests b4, castles, and then maybe rook d1. And then black has a lot of ideas. f6 is one. He could play a5 and knight d8, reroute the knight to e6. And finally, another idea is bishop g5. And the bishop gets to f4, probably black is better. So white really has to give up the e5 pawn. Okay, this is, again, white paying for the king on e2. Rook e8. And, okay, black has an isolated d-pawn, but it's also a pass pawn. And I think it's an even position. So there are lots of possibilities for black. I don't think this is something, you know, prepared out to a white advantage. Knight d4. But this maybe gives white a little bit more, because now he can protect the pawn, and he has a chance also to get the king off of the e-file. Queen d2 is gaining a little time, threatening bishop h7. And now he's able to put the rooks in the middle of the board. But still, Wesley So probably thought he had a pretty good position breaking with f6. You know, if white takes, then black can, you know, activate his bishop and his rooks. He seems to have some play in the white king. You know, certainly seems like an okay position. But Carlsen, this is just a wonderful move. And he played it pretty quickly, so maybe somehow this is opening preparation. I don't really see how that's even possible. But it really is a wonderful move. Just giving away a pawn. It turns out white would rather not even take the pawn on f6, because it's just in the way, and there's all these big light square weaknesses, and the d5 pawn is very hard to defend. Now, it's hard to say exactly what are the best moves around here, but at this moment we could say that f5 probably is a mistake, because that pawn becomes a real target in the endgame. One possible move for black is bishop e5, although it takes some guts to play it. White doesn't necessarily have to take the bishop, but let's say he does. King g3, queen e6, and the computer says if the bishop, let's say, goes back to b1 or c2, black can go e4. And the thing is, it's very hard for white to get the king out of there. Black has a lot of possibilities of perpetual check. And if the bishop comes to h5, rook f5, if bishop g4, queen g6 pinning, if bishop e2, e4, again, setting threats on that diagonal. It's very complicated, but black has maybe about equal chances. That's not an easy call to make over the board, just pointing that out for fun. He plays f5, queen check, takes. And now he plays bishop c5. Okay, otherwise white was ready to take d5, rook e5. And now rook f6, he ends up losing two pawns this way, going down one. He could have played in this position bishop back to d6, a little paradoxical. But if rook e takes d5, rook f6 hitting the bishop, bishop f5, g6, and then black gets to take the f4 pawn. So white could maybe try rook to f5, but then black could, I think he could move this bishop, so like bishop c7. And, he's not immediately losing a pawn. White can be clearly better, but rook f8, king f8, rook e1, something like that. But black at least holds on to the d pawn. So rook f6, bishop f5, bishop d6. Now rook d takes d5. That's the key move. That's probably what's so overlooked. And now he gets to hold on to everything. King f7, rook e4, bishop g4. Maybe it was unnecessary to provoke h5. And this is a very interesting move because now black gets a lot of counterplay. On the other hand, Magnus is aware that just being a pawn up in this type of ending is no guarantee of victory. So, maybe he doesn't mind so much, getting into this mess after g5, where now the f4 pawn is attacked, but so is his bishop. So he plays g3, offering to give up his bishop for these pawns. Then he has 3 passed pawns, and he's getting ready to take the pawn in b7. Okay, he has a big advantage there. So Wesley decided to play b6, and now it's possible for the bishop to go back to f1, and white is a clear pawn up. Okay, not game over by any means, but Magnus decided to maintain this sacrifice. And now there's not going to be that much more commentary on the rest of the moves because it's hard to say, what he should have done. But he wasn't able to hold everything on the queen side, and I think it was suggested that black play a4. It's a subtle difference. If white plays rook b4, he gets the a pawn, but black can play bishop g1, rook takes a4, bishop takes pawn, and maybe this is a better shot because black has the possibility of getting the rook on that third rank and attack the g pawn. So white has 4 pawns, but maybe black has some hope. All right, so rook h2, rook takes a5, rook e2. Now, okay, Magnus plays very skillfully. He bothers the bishop a lot, so he makes it he forces it to go one way or the other. And, he's got his pawns pretty well safeguarded. All right, he handles that attack and constantly able to pick up tempi here and there. And he pushes those pawns forward. Now, the bishop can sacrifice for 2 pawns, but the problem is white will have 2 pawns left. He just has a little bit too much to work with. Now, one problem is that if black takes the pawn and he has a chance to do it to move later, I guess the problem is going to be rook f5, and that forces a trade, and then white is able to win because the pawns are going to win on the queen side, and even if black has had time to get his king over to the queen side, then white would just push the f pawn through. So Carlsen appreciates that if he just exchanges a piece, he's going to win the game. So again, the same idea. And again, bothering the bishop. Not a threat to take on f4, but he pins it anyway. And still bishop f4, rook f3. Now he defends and he's getting ready for rook b4. So looks to me like very good technique. Again, taking is hopeless. And now Carlsen certainly doesn't need to, but he sacrifices rook just to make it simple. He's getting ready to queen. And if check, he can hide the king on a6. The king goes to a7, he makes a queen, and he queens the a pawn. So nice finish there. Good endgame technique by Carlsen. And I felt that the beginning of the game was kind of sketchy. I remember seeing it. I commented on it during my Banter Blitz session. I thought, I don't know, he was taking liberties. But big win for Carlsen as he gets back on the leaderboard. All right, meanwhile, Shaq Mami had an easy time as Peter Svidler, he simply did not have his head in this game. He made some questionable calls in the opening, put him on the defensive, and Mamajara's aggressive play enabled him to win a virtual miniature. All right, so that one, we get to that one here. Svidler playing white. Say wasted a white is an understatement. I don't know if this opening was any bit of a surprise. I mean, it's a fairly standard one. And Svidler just first kind of a non-standard move, bishop f4. Most people put the bishop on g5, and after knight e4, so black, I guess, gets this in without pushing all the kingside pawns. Queen a4 check is actually a novelty, just not played in this position. Queen b3, queen c2, but mostly rook c1, defending c3. Queen a4 is really kind of questionable because it doesn't seem to help that much to put the knight on c6. Okay, yeah, it stops black from playing c5, but you still have to spend a move to defend this, and black castles, so he gets the knight unpinned, and already white is really kind of getting outgunned here, because if he plays e3, g5, bishop g3, h5 is unpleasant for white. Black is threatening h4 to trap the bishop, and if white has to touch the h-pawn, then knight takes g3 will cause some unpleasant weakness on e3. All right, so Svidler didn't want that, so he plays g3, but very awkward looking. The bishop doesn't really belong coming out that way, and Mamedyarov, you don't have to ask him twice to take the initiative, and he pounds forward f5, and bishop g2. This as well probably wasn't a great move, because after f4, white is not able to use this f file. The g file with the bishop sitting on g2. Although if he didn't take on f4, then black would have the possibility of pushing forward with g4, attacking the knight, chasing it away. So now bishop d2 and king h8. So black is going to use the g file. And you might think like, well, the king side is busted open, the black king, and black has castled, white hasn't castled. Seems better, yeah? But no, because white isn't getting to the queen side, so his king is just in the center, which means he can't coordinate. And queen b3, I don't know what that's about. I just don't know, because that just invites the knight to come into this beautiful square at c4, and the white piece is even more tied down. Rook d1, and now rook g8, knight e5. Oh, it's already very desperate times. If rook g1, black has a very cool move in bishop h3. If white takes, rook g1, knight g1, queen h4, and white just doesn't have any way to defend f2 other than queen takes knight, so it's basically game over. So he tries knight e5, very desperate. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e4. And this could almost work, but Shaq has this powerful move, queen g5, very nice, threatening queen g1 mate. And he tries bishop f4. What else can he do? Rook f1, okay, that stops the mate. He could take the bishop, and if pawn takes knight, even stronger than e3, I think, is bishop h3. And black is threatening to take the rook, and that's a full rook, because white can't take back with the mate on g1, and just can't get out of that, so just position collapses. So he tried bishop f4, at least distracts the queen, bishop d5, bishop f5. Now, when I first played over this game, and so I resigned after 21 moves, I thought, oh yeah, I guess he's resigning because knight d3 check is coming. And that's true that black is ready to play knight d3 check, but then I counted the piece and realized that black is sacrificing that piece from being a piece up. So he's going to sacrifice knight d3 and bring the rook to the e file. And if the king ever goes to f1, bishop h3 is mating. So just white position just totally collapses. So an utter debacle for Svidler. Mamedyarov scores a point without having to work too hard, which is always nice, and he gets back among the leaders as well. Now Kramnik kept within range of the leaders by defeating the hapless Matlockov, who again missed some chances for an advantage and ultimately could not defend in time pressure. I have to say that Kramnik has really been a fun player to watch in the last few years because he's gotten very bold. You know, I guess he just feels like, I don't know, he doesn't care if he loses games. He's going to try to win, and he really goes for it. And it's interesting that he's taken up e4. And, you know, the reason is because he's not having to face the Sicilian very much when he plays it. He's facing e5. And he knows these positions very well, of course, from playing the black side. But he, you know, he knows that it's generally a maneuvering type of game. It's not necessarily heavy on theory, so it's not really much of an adjustment for him to switch over from the black side to the white side. It's pretty much the same. Now, this bishop g5. You know, I teach, you know, little kids, and we talk about the Gioco piano a lot, usually with a knight on c3. And of course, this kind of pin is generally more effective when black has castled in the Gioco piano. But if he hasn't played d6, he can just bring the bishop back to e7. And I think that this usually takes the sting out of the bishop g5. I think that Carlsen tried this against Karyakin, and I think he won that game, but Karyakin didn't have any problems in the opening. And this knight h5 is a pretty simple answer. White doesn't really get much from the exchange of bishops, and now black knight is ready to come into f4, and Kramnik answers this in a very interesting way. He actually just sends his king to the left. Really kind of a bold move. And Matlockov prepares for white's d4, but he's not able to discourage him. Kramnik does it anyway. Okay, so now over the next couple of moves, Matlockov misses a few opportunities to go for it. And the first one is bishop takes a2. And this is one of those moves, to play it, you got to believe, you know. And you have to believe that your esteemed opponent, Kramnik, is not letting you take that pawn. So it kind of looks like the Bobby Fischer bishop trap, right? But after b3, black has a5. King b2, a4. So that's that. It gets the bishop out. You know, white has one moment to take the bishop, but if he takes it now, this is exceedingly dangerous. Black plays d5. If white had thrown in d takes e5, d takes e5, obviously wouldn't be able to take the bishop because queen b6. Now queen b6 is coming, and basically white's position is not defensible. If king b2 trying to interpose, the black queen slides d6, threatening to come in here. And if, let's say, something like rook a1, black could take on e4. If white takes on e4, then queen b4 check is powerful, but there really isn't any other move. The knight moves queen d4. That position just collapses. So, all right, what that means is white cannot take the bishop, just cannot take it. So he can take on a4, and then the bishop can come back to e6. And, okay, it's not like it wins for black, but it certainly kind of feels better for black with that the white king kind of in a precarious position. I think that Matlockov would have liked to play this position. But still he gets another interesting opportunity. He plays rook ac8, and after king b1, he just plays simply rook c7, which is not good enough. He has another fairly strong move, but also an unlikely move. Rook takes c2. And that rook can be taken 3 different ways. But none of them are entirely satisfactory. Queen takes is obviously not so great because the knight on f3 hangs. But the other ones look reasonable. King takes, and here you have to see queen g6 attacking e4, and white doesn't really have a satisfactory answer to that. Of course, he's got other points in the center that he has to hold, so knight d2 is not so good, and you know, moving the knight in e3 allows things, you know, like f5 could be a strong move. Too much pressure on the white position. If he takes with the knight, which computer says relatively best, then there's bishop g4. So there's 3 different problems with the 3 different captures. Rook d3, knight c6. Now white is a pincushion here. If he plays d5, knight d4, takes, and black is ready to come with knight g5. White doesn't have a way to answer that. Actually, just back it up. So relatively best is queen e3 from this position, but then black can take the knight and play knight takes f2 with a fork. And this is actually white's best because it comes out to a position where he gives up a pawn, but is maybe not that much worse. So that's, you know, Kramnik would have had to do some fancy stepping after rook takes c2, but that's really Matlokov's moment. And now Kramnik starts to take control of the position, but still, it's a tough game. All right, g6. This is a mistake. Now white definitely gets the initiative. He should have stopped white's next move with rook c6, which of course does, because rook d6, black can take, or even play this first, bishop a2, right? Takes the rook. So rook c6 is the best move. g6, rook d6. That pin is very uncomfortable for black. Rook c6. Now white still gets this move in. All right, so black plays rook f8, anticipating the trade, and then we have a little bit of a dance. Rook d3. Rook goes back to c8, threatening the back rank. So he comes back. They're repeating. Both players have a lot of moves to go to get the time control. And Kramnik plays a3, which is a mistake because now black gets an h5, which is a more useful move. He should have taken on e6 right away. Now the bishop is hitting the knight. So if rook takes d6, bishop takes h3. If he takes, then white plays rook d8. And this is a strong move because he's threatening knight to g4. So for instance, rook c8, knight g4. And black cannot take the knight. Queen takes knight, queen takes f3. So that's the difference. He plays a3, and only after h5 he decides there's nothing better than taking. But now it's not so clear. Rook d8 now can be met fairly effectively by rook c8, kind of neutralizes. There's no knight g4, and black is able to maintain a rook on the f-file. So instead of rook d8, he tries rook d7, and now there's, like, you know, tactics almost every move. He could have taken f3, takes, rook e7, rook f7, and they get to an ending. Both sides start taking pawns, but black can certainly play this. It's probably in his best interest to make some trades, as his king is potentially more exposed. He plays knight c8. He's also starting to slip into time pressure. Knight c4, very complicated. He could have also played knight h4, not putting anything on prise, with advantage. But knight c4 is a tricky move. Queen takes f3 would not be so good because after knight takes e5, the rook has to run back. There's not only the rook on c6 hanging, but rook d8 possibility winning the knight. So white will take the rook on c6, and he has a lot of pawns and very active rooks, and it's worth too much. So he tries knight f2, And now white could just take the knight on f2. Rook takes c4, and then he could just defend the knight. This would also be good position, but I don't blame Kramnik for going for this exchange sacrifice. It looks very promising. The knights are really kind of beating up on that rook, which should go to b6 is also another tough call, but it's just safe there. It's hard for black to move a little bit, but it keeps everything defended better. But he's getting very short of time now. Rook c5, queen d4, and knight b6. It looks like a clever move because if white takes the rook, knight takes d7, knight d7, queen f3, and white can simplify, but it's going to be even pawns, pawn ending with even pawns. So he doesn't need to get back the exchange. He takes on b7, and now there are some mistakes with the flags hanging. Rook b5. I actually saw this position live, and I thought knight c6 would be very strong with ideas of knight e7, setting up a discovered check, and the computer says that's very strong. But also Kramnik's simple capture on a7 is good too. Rook d8, and now queen c3. This is actually a mistake. He should play rook f7. Okay, black has to take the queen. And white wipes out a lot of pawns. Black can play knight d5, which indirectly defends the rook because of knight c3 check. So he doesn't lose. He doesn't have to give back the exchange. But in the meantime, white has 3 extra pawns for the exchange and his good winning chances. All right, so he goes queen c3, rook c8. But he misses the opportunity for knight d7 and takes advantage of the fact that knight e5 is actually pinned. He can't take the knight because the queen takes queen, be pawn pinned. So black would get to trade his woeful knight on b6 for that monster on e5. And so this would actually immediately kind of equalize chances. White has 2 pawns to the exchange, maybe still more pleasant, say rook a5 is possible. But knight d7 gets black back in the game. The rook c8, rook c7, white is winning again. And after rook d8, rook f7 would be very powerful now. I'm not sure why he didn't play it. He played instead queen c6. Well, okay, the rook doesn't really have a good place to go. It allows rook takes e5. White could take the rook and take on b6. And he's winning that ending. He's going to be a pawn up, and the black king is going to be very exposed. I don't think Kramnik would have much trouble with that. But still, relatively better than rook b3, rook f7. And even with flags hanging, that's that, because there's just no answer. Black is not losing the queen, but he's going to drop some other pieces as well. So very interesting game. Of course, there's a lot of back and forth in that time scramble. But in addition to that, those 2 moments, bishop a2, rook takes c2, those are moments where you have to really believe that an unlikely move can work. And, nobody wants to waste time when you got so many moves. But, if Matt Lockhoff had looked deeper into that position, he would have found a good opportunity. But another tough loss for him. Okay, so we're going to move on to the final game today. Vishy Anand, who had tailed off after a fast start, he regained his touch with a convincing win over Gawain Jones. And Jones learned that opening preparation is a little loftier when you get up 100 points or so. And really in this game, he made one mistake and he was finished. So let's have a look. And you see now in Jones's world, he plays obviously in a lot more open tournaments. He still plays against a lot of good grandmasters, but not normally in this this category, although occasionally he's played in the London Classic, so he's had a taste. Um, but he plays an opening that this is kind of thing that is more popular, maybe a level down, and I've played it myself. It's very provocative. One very popular way to meet is Queen C7 followed by G5, and then Knight G5, Queen takes E5, D4 is the main line. And years ago, I scored a big victory over Joe Gallagher in the World Team Championship. I think that was in '97. Of course, that's about 20 years ago, and there's been a lot more advanced of the theory since then. But Anand goes for D6, and this is a good line too. As Black plays for very quick development. Okay, White can try to play D4, but Black can take en passant, and he'll get very quick play in the D file. If White takes with the queen, then Black can mess up can double White's pawn. So White is going to play ambitiously, and there have been a few games here where he's going to play with B3 to undermine those pawns. But first bishop E4, E6, and this is all known, and G6 looks like a funny move with the bishop on H5, but Anand wants to run those pawns forward in the center. Note that he doesn't take on B3. If you take on B3 here, White takes with the pawn, and then he's ready to play D4, and he's also got that A file, and everything comes forward. So, Black is, taking advantage of this pawn on C4 that it's holding White up, and he's pushing E5 very fast. Now, this position has occurred a couple of times, and White has played D3. And in both games, Black played E4. It's interesting. D takes E4. Now, if Queen takes D1, that hasn't been played, but I did a little looking on the computer. At first, this looks strong for Black, but the threat to F3 isn't so powerful because of G4. So White can play bishop G5. So if you take the knight, take the rook, and play G4. All right, so let's say rook D7. And then we have a very interesting variation here. Okay, let's say knight BD2. All right, EF3, what else? Rook E8 check, knight D8. Now we're not ready for this bishop yet. C5, this is an important move. If the knight goes to D5, then bishop A4 is a problem. And White gets to take that rook, and then he can play G4 in the end and win that one too. So Black has to go knight A8 so that he can answer bishop A4 with rook takes D2. And then he's able to save the bishop. So White could instead now play G4. So we could see something like knight C7, hitting the rook, some trading. Probably better than knight C7 is actually to take on G4 because it's going to get taken on H5 otherwise. Knight C7, takes, 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 takes. And after all that, we get this ending where White has an extra pawn, but bishop's out the colors. And I don't know if White really has that much of an advantage, even with an extra pawn. But it's a very interesting line. Okay, now what actually happens in the games, D3, E4, takes, not takes, but in the two games, Black answered D4 with Queen C7, Queen E2, Knight E5. White could play Knight BD2 first. It's going to transpose Knight BD2, Bishop C5, and I think that in all the games, White played King H1. In both games, White played King H1, and then Rook takes D2, which is not completely necessary, but it's very interesting. Bishop takes, Knight takes F3, Pawn takes F3, Knight takes C4. White can't take the Knight because of Bishop F3, and then Queen G3 mates. This happened in a couple of games. I think both ended up being draws, and it looks quite unclear. So I don't know if Vichy had an improvement up his sleeve against d3, but Gawain plays d4, and I don't know if he forgot the theory or he just decided he had an improvement. But it's very instructive how this fails, and he played it relatively quickly. Bishop g5, but it's an instructive moment for me because I find that that players on the lower level, let's say below master, tend to value a move like Bishop g5 a little bit more than they should, and even a player as strong as Gawain Jones doesn't anticipate that the threat of taking the rook is not that big a deal, as Anand just plays Bishop g7, sacrificing exchange, and White is basically just falling apart in the center, and there's not really much he can do here. He's undeveloped. Black pieces are dominant, and if he takes on d4, Black can play knight takes d4, and really the position is collapsing. White is going to be losing material, so he plays queen d3 and then queen d2, which is definitely not a solution. He gets the piece out, but this monster pawn on c3, White can never get rid of it, and the extra exchange is no consolation. So Black can do almost anything, and Vichy just played with total control from here. His piece is just jumping all over the place and just not giving White anything. He just defends everything, and then he decides to pump that knight over to f4. And he trades, and basically he knows he's winning on the queen side. b3 is coming, and I think Black is going to queen a pawn in a few moves. So Jones resigned. So yeah, he tried out this new move d4, and then it was over. So Vichy Anand getting back to his winning ways. All right. So after round 10, we again have a triumvirate at the top: Carlsen, Giri, Mamedyarov. With 7 points, and they're followed by Kramnik at 6.5, and Anand at 6, and a couple of guys at 5.5. In the B group, unsurprisingly, it's Korobov and Vidit who have been at the top the whole way, dominating with 7, and they're 1.5 points ahead of everyone else in the field, at least. Tata Steel returns tomorrow for round 11, as usual. You can watch the games live on ICC. We will also present a live recap for the last 3 rounds. So it should be an exciting finish. I think it's been a pretty good tournament so far. Well, I hope that it was as fun to watch the recap as it was for me to talk about these games. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Goodbye, everyone.